this week I should say, we begin a new book of the Chumash, Sefer Vayikra. And there's one concept which goes through the Sefer, which is the idea of Korban, the idea of sacrifice. And it's not part of our experience. We don't practice animal sacrifice today. But since it occupies such a central place in the Torah, we certainly have to at least try to understand it. And before we embark on that, I'd like to first remove a misconception. It's a misconception that no practicing Jew should have, but somehow it has slipped into the minds of many. There are people who believe that we've left animal sacrifice behind forever, and we're never going to return to it. And even when Mashiach comes and the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, the Beis HaMikdash will be a house of prayer, but there will not be animal sacrifice. Now, the truth is that our prayers clearly indicate the contrary. Every Shabbos we pray Musaf, and we declare V'sham na'aseh lefanecha Korbonos that when the temple is rebuilt, we will perform these sacrifices, the sacrifices that should have been brought on Shabbos and Yom Tov, we will perform. So it's clear from the prayers that there's an expectation that Mashiach will restore animal sacrifice. The truth is, it's not only from the weekly prayers, the daily prayers. The Shemona Esrei contains the bracha of Ritzei, wherein we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring about the restoration of Ishay Yisrael, the fire offerings of the Jewish people, meaning the offerings that are burnt on the altar. So it's clear 100% from our prayers that our hope and expectation is that the Korbonos will be restored. So obviously we don't look at the Korbonos as being something primitive or something superstitious, something that we've outgrown, but to the contrary, something very profound which we hope to return to. It happens to be that on this point, the non-Orthodox movements within Judaism have taken issue. The conservative movement's official position is that in the Messianic age, animal sacrifice will not be restored. Now, you wouldn't know it, because there are many conservative synagogues today that use the Art Scroll Siddur. So obviously they're using an Orthodox prayer book and they're reciting the prayers that indicate the restoration of animal sacrifice. But if you go back to the 1948 Silverman edition, pardon?
They're not just recognizing it, they're praying that it should be.
They're praying for it. But if you go back to the 1948 Silverman edition of the conservative prayer book, and in his introduction, and Rabbi Morris Silverman, who was the editor of that, I have something in common with, because he was a rabbi in Hartford, Connecticut, where I'm from. In the introduction, he explains that, of course, we don't anticipate performing such bizarre and primitive rituals, and therefore he amended the wording of the prayers. And therefore, in that prayer book's version of the Musaf, it doesn't say V'sham na'aseh lefanecha in future tense, we will perform the animal sacrifices. It makes reference to the fact that once upon a time in the past, shesham asu lefanecha. Now, the truth is that it doesn't make much sense, because if we really believe that they are primitive, why are we nostalgic for them? Because why would we mention in our prayers, oh, the good old days when we brought animal sacrifices? If it's something which really is barbaric, then we should put it behind us, good riddance once and for all. So obviously, even his attempt to amend the prayers really doesn't accomplish anything. I once had a discussion with a fellow in a class that I gave. This goes back years and years ago. And I made this point that this was the position of the conservative movement. And the fellow in the class, very, very fine fellow, who was a member of a conservative synagogue, told me he doesn't believe that the conservative movement would reject the idea of sacrifice in the Messianic age. So I told him, go ask the rabbi of your synagogue and see what he says. So I won't identify the rabbi, but he did ask the rabbi of the synagogue, and the rabbi said If that is the only grievance that Rabbi Breitowitz has with the conservative movement, I don't feel so bad. That's what he said. Now, the truth is, it is a major grievance, because if you look through the Rambam's 613 mitzvahs and ask yourself, how many of the 613 mitzvahs relate to the service in the temple and the laws of purity and impurity, which are an adjunct to the laws of sacrifice, it really is about 150 out of the 613, meaning that if you reject sacrifice, it's not you're throwing out one or two mitzvahs, which is bad enough. You're throwing out really a quarter of the Torah out the window. So obviously that's not acceptable. One of the fundamentals of faith is that the Torah is eternal. And our inability to bring sacrifices today should be considered analogous to a person who's in prison without a pair of tefillin. Doesn't mean that the mitzvah of tefillin isn't applicable to him. It just means that he's constrained because of circumstances beyond his control. He can't perform the mitzvah. So likewise, we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, so we are constrained by circumstances beyond our control from performing these mitzvahs. But we believe, as a matter of faith, that when Mashiach comes, they will be restored, and that these mitzvahs are not primitive or barbaric, but really there is a beauty and a subtlety and a meaning behind them which we have to try to appreciate. That doesn't make the job any easier, by the way. But the fact that it is so far removed from our experience makes it very, very difficult for us to understand. But we have to try. And in the past years, we've discussed various approaches. I think tonight I'd like to say something which I believe is new, something which I haven't seen, and I don't think I've said on other occasions. So this is a little bit of a chidush. But I'll bring it out with something which may be familiar. The Talmud tells us that the 3 daily prayers were ordained to correspond to the sacrifices of the temple. Of the temple. Now we know that when the temple stood, there was a daily sacrifice in the morning, every morning, 365 days a year, called the Tamid Shel Shachar. This was the daily continual offering brought in the morning, Tamid Shel Shachar. In the afternoon, there was another similar, really identical sacrifice called the Tamid Shel Bein HaArbayim. These were sheep. One lamb was brought in the morning, one lamb was brought in the afternoon. In the evening, the body parts of these sacrifices were burnt on the altar. They could have been burnt during the day, but if they hadn't been burnt during the day, they would be burnt the following night. And that's called the Haktaras Emurim. This is the burning of the specified parts of the sacrifice. So Chazal say that when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the rabbis ordained that we should pray the Shacharis prayer to make up for the loss of the sacrifice of the morning, and we prayed the Mincha prayer in the afternoon to make up for the not bringing the second afternoon sacrifice, and Ma'ariv corresponds to the burning of the body parts in the night. The Gemara also says that these 3 prayers correspond to the 3 Avos, the 3 patriarchs. So Shacharis corresponds to Avraham Avinu, and Mincha corresponds to Yitzchak Avinu, and Yaakov corresponds to Ma'ariv. The question is there some connection? Is there some connection between Yaakov and a prayer which corresponds to the offering of the body parts? Now, I think there is a connection, but to understand that, we first have to discuss a little bit, maybe in graphic detail, exactly what happens when you bring a carbon. You bring an animal to the Beis HaMikdash. So first, there are 4 steps which we call the Avodas Hadam. These are the steps in the procedure for the offering of the blood. First is the Shchita. The animal is slaughtered. Shchita. The animal is slaughtered. Then there's Kabbalas Hadam. The blood is received in a receptacle, in a bowl. That's called Kabbalah. You receive the blood. Then there's Halacha. Halacha is you bring the bowl with the blood to the altar. And then there is the Zvika. The blood is poured, spilled, cast at the wall of the altar. So there are 4 steps: the shechita, the kabbalah, the halacha, and the yisrika. The slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the transporting of the blood to the altar, and the pouring of the blood on the altar. These 4 steps must be performed. If these are not done, the korban is not a korban. The korban has no validity. These are absolutely essential elements to the offering of a korban. After that, what's done with the rest of the animal depends on the type of korban. Certain animals are burnt entirely on the altar. That's called the korban olah. Certain other korbonos, parts are burnt on the altar and parts are eaten. So that depends on the type of korban. But let's talk about a korban olah, a burnt offering.
Are these 4 steps all done by the kohen?
The shechita can be done by anybody, but after the shechita, it must be done by a kohen. Now, in the case of the korban olah, the halacha is that the entire animal is burnt on the altar. So after the blood is spilt on the altar, the body of the animal is cut up and placed on the fire on top of the altar. But here is a curious thing. Here the halacha is that, let's say the body parts disappeared. The halacha is that the sacrifice is still valid. So for example, let's say a person made a vow to bring a sacrifice. So if the animal was slaughtered and the blood disappeared, it's not a valid sacrifice. He hasn't fulfilled his vow, and he'd have to bring another animal for the fulfillment of the promise. But on the other hand, if the blood was spilled on the altar, the sacrifice is a valid sacrifice. The vow has been fulfilled. Even if ultimately the parts of the animal are not burnt in the altar. If they're lost, they disappear, they become defiled, and they can't be brought on the altar, the korban is still a valid korban. Which seems to imply the following, that the offering of the blood is essential, and the offering of the parts of the body is really like icing on the cake. You should do it, it's preferable, but if something happens and you can't do it, it's also okay, it's good enough. But the offering of the blood is essential. So you have to understand that. I mean, if we're offering the entire animal to God, why is it the offering of the blood is essential, and the burning of the body part could be dispensed with if necessary? And why is that not equally critical? We know from the Torah that the blood symbolizes the nefesh. The blood symbolizes the life force, the soul, so to speak, of the animal. If I were to ask a person, where does the soul of a person reside? We would tend to think the soul is a spiritual concept. It doesn't occupy any specific location within the body of a human. But the Torah seems to say that the nefesh, the seat of the nefesh, is the dam, is the blood. And therefore it would seem that the offering of the blood somehow relates to the nefesh, to the soul. The rest of the animal, the limbs, the meat, the fat, etc., undoubtedly corresponds to the body. By analogy, a human being is made of body and soul. An animal is also made of body and soul. The blood corresponds to the soul. The rest of the animal corresponds to the body. What is really happening when we bring a korban? So this is my conjecture. My conjecture is that what we really are meant to contemplate in the offering of the sacrifice is the interaction of the body and the soul, the relationship of the body and the soul. Now, this is a very complex issue. Let's take it from the beginning. Chazal tell us that the soul of a human being pre-exists the person's life on this earth. before the soul is put into a body, the soul exists in heaven. It studies Torah from a malach, etc. It is privy to all the great secrets. There's a statement in the Medrash even that the souls are carved from under the Kisei HaKavod, the heavenly throne. The souls are very, very, very lofty. And the souls are then put into bodies, and they're sent into this world. It seems that the souls have become very much diminished, because a newborn baby can't do much of anything. I mean, it has a soul, but it can't really speak, and it can't really think, and it can't do many of the things that we would attribute to a soul. So what really has happened? What really has happened is this, is that the soul has been put into a prison, into a straitjacket, if you will, which is the body. The body constrains the soul. That soul, moments before it was placed into the body, when it was a disembodied soul, could soar, could achieve lofty spiritual attainments. But now it's been put into this body, and the body constrains the soul. It's really a straitjacket. It really limits the ability of the soul to function. But what the soul does is the soul fosters growth. It fosters the development of that body. And we see that newborn baby grows and develops and can begin to walk and can begin to talk and begin to think rationally and start doing great things. And what really is taking place is that the soul slowly is conquering the body. The soul is overpowering the body. It is elevating the body, to use a word from the early history of psychoanalysis. It is sublimating the body, meaning making the body sublime, refining it, elevating it, perfecting it. And this is what's happening up until a point. And why this is only up until a point is a very, very interesting thing. And this we did speak about in the past. That originally, in God's original plan, the soul that was placed into Adam Harishon, into the first man, in theory would have had the power to elevate and refine Adam's body to the point that it would become a spiritual entity just like the soul. But as a consequence of the initial chet, there were certain imperfections that were introduced into the body of Adam Harishon, and therefore as a consequence into the bodies of all his descendants. And therefore there is a limit, there's a glass ceiling, if you will, to the extent to which the body can be refined. So yes, a person can achieve great things intellectually and spiritually, but there still is an upper limit. But that upper limit is probably much higher than we think. Because even in our experience, we know there are very, very lofty people. And when you just hear stories about Gedolei Yisrael, you hear stories about great people, you wonder, wow, how is it possible that a human being could have this level of refinement, this level of sensitivity? But it happens. Let's say a small story. I just mentioned it because I saw it yesterday and it made an impression on me. There was a very, very great Talmud Chacham. His name was Reb Chaim Brim. He lived in Yerushalayim in Eretz Yisrael. He passed away a couple of years ago. And he was speaking at a gathering. There were several speakers. He was the last speaker. And the speaker immediately before him got up and he took out his notes from his pocket. And he opened his notes, said his drasha, then sat down. And then it was Reb Chaim Brim's turn to speak. And he got up and he took out his notes from his pocket and he opened them up and put them on the podium. And he gave his speech and sat down. And by mistake, he left his notes on the podium. So a fellow that was straightening up afterward went and he picked the notes. And he noticed that the notes were really a blank piece of paper. So what had happened?
He's pretending.
Embarrassed.
He didn't want to embarrass the person that spoke before him, who needed notes. So therefore, he acted as if he also needed notes. But in reality, it was a blank piece of paper. So you think, wow, like how could a person be so sensitive? I'll tell you another Maisa, just a similar Maisa. The Satmar Rebbe was called to the Torah 1 year in Rosh Hashanah. And he was called to the Torah, and there was a spelling mistake in the Sefer Torah. There was a word that should have been written with the letter Ches, and it was written with the letter Chaf. Now, we're not talking about a minor mistake. Remember, this is a mistake. It's obvious. It's a mistake. So, the Satmar Rebbe gets to Eliyah, and he looks. He scrutinizes. Sometimes in the show, you see when there's a question of the Sefer Torah, you know, the rabbi looks, and he looks again, and he scrutinizes, and he looks again. He's wondering, maybe it is okay, maybe it isn't okay, you know. But the person that was reading the Torah saw that it was a blatant error. Obviously, it couldn't be justified anyway. And the Satmar Rebbe spent 10 minutes looking at it, and thinking and scratching his head, and finally ruled they should replace it with another Sefer Torah. So the Balkarei, the person who was reading the Torah, asked the Rebbe afterwards, says, Rebbe, what took so long? It was easy to see it was a spelling mistake. So the Satmar Rebbe said, because the cipher that wrote that Sefer Torah was in shul. And if I would have said, "Hey, look here, spelling mistake," right, what a terrible embarrassment. So therefore, I made it look as if perhaps there was something that could have arisen after the Sefer Torah was written. Maybe a letter was cracked, the ink began to peel, or something like that. So it wouldn't be an embarrassment for that person. I mean, you hear stories like this, and you say, wow, a level of refinement such as that. But I'll tell you a story I saw this week, which is the clincher. I don't know if you get Mishpacha magazine. So there's a story about Rav Neishlos. Rav Neishlos was the Dayan of Skver. Passed away about 12 years ago. So when he was in the hospital, in his last illness, so he asked if he could be taken to the mikveh. He wanted to go to the mikveh. So they told him, look, you're hooked up to the machines, the tubes, you can't just take you to the mikveh. He says, okay. He says, bring me Meseches Mikvos. The Masechta, the Mishnah talks about the mikveh. And they brought the Sefer to him. And the entire night, he studied Maseches Mikvos, and when he finished, he closed his eyes and he passed away. Because he wanted to have the mikveh before he passed away. So he couldn't go to the actual mikveh. He learned Maseches Mikvos. So you see people like this, and there are stories, dozens and dozens and hundreds of stories, because you see that a human being can achieve a very, very lofty level of refinement. There's a level which is unimaginable.